My name's Daniel. I have worked night audit at a mid-sized hotel on the edge of downtown for the better part of 7 years. The hotel sits where the city thins out, where neon signs blur into older brick buildings, and the freeway noise sounds like a distant ocean. I took the night shift because I liked the hours, and because it meant silence that I could measure. The lobby lights at 1 in the morning, the hum of the vending machine, the exact click of the elevator doors closing. I brought with me a battered leather notebook and a habit of watching small things. For a long time, the routine was a comfort. Guests would come and go, suitcases with wheels and bodies with stories, like weather passing through a fixed frame. The hotel had quirks: a cracked tile by the third-floor window, a humming boiler in the basement, and an out-of-service room on the 4th floor that everyone joked about and avoided. That room had a faded bedspread, an empty closet, and a brass plaque that said "Out of Service" in neat capital letters. It became my landmark, the way a tree becomes a landmark on a long walk. One night I noticed the laundry cart in front of the room was moved. The cart was not there when I did rounds 15 minutes earlier. I frowned, shrugged it off, but the next night the hallway smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, even though our hotel was non-smoking, and there were no ashtrays in any room. The smell came from the direction of the out-of-service door. I asked myself how a closed room could create a scent that seeped through the keycard reader and traveled down the corridor. I checked the log, I asked the housekeeper Maria, I called maintenance. Nobody had entered that room on the roster. I set up a small action in my head that would start as curiosity and become a slow obsession. I would find out who was in room 412, or else prove to myself it was nonsense. I remembered the soft thud of the cart, the way the light over the corridor flickered, and how the plaque read like an invitation. I recorded these things in my leather notebook and told myself this was work. I also told myself I should sleep. Before that summer, I had lived with a different kind of fear. I grew up in a small coastal town where my father ran a bait shop and my mother kept a bed and breakfast with lace curtains and teacups lined like teeth. In childhood, I learned the rhythms of strangers crossing thresholds. I learned to listen to footsteps and to name them. My early life taught me to catalog small details. In college, I studied hospitality management because it made sense, because I liked ordering things and putting them in place. There was a year I lost my brother in a car accident, and for a long time, noise felt like a betrayal. The hospital corridors taught me that schedules can stop instantly. After the funeral, I moved away and took the night job at the hotel because it held a predictable loneliness. The small rituals of unlocking, of making change, of reading the logs helped me feel steady. When I went back to my hometown and walked into my mother's bed and breakfast, the teacups reminded me of the way people arrive expecting comfort and sometimes leave with secrets. So when the out-of-service room began to feel like an ache in the building, I recognized the pattern. Voids attract attention, and attention becomes responsibility. The first week of oddities was a string of small things that made me check my hands like a person who has been found with someone else's fingerprints on a glass. A guest reported a television that turned on by itself at 3 in the morning. A maintenance ticket recorded 2 minutes of static in the security feed outside the back service door. Anna from housekeeping said she found a cigarette butt in a wastebasket in the hall that smelled like cherry. Jenna at the front desk said a phone in the office rang with no caller ID and no one spoke when she picked up. I began to write their names into my notebook, and each name, like a pebble, dropped into a jar. Mark, the general manager, came by one quiet night and smiled too easily. Theo from maintenance flipped his flashlight and told me a story about a past manager who kept late hours and used an old master key. Mrs. Carter, who managed bookings from an adjacent bed and breakfast, said that certain rooms had reputations and that guests sometimes checked out sweating and with empty wallets. Mr. Wallace from the concierge desk described a woman who had once claimed to see a man standing in a doorway looking like a reflection without a body. These people were not connected except by the thin thread of nervous attention. I named them aloud because names make disorder easier to hold. The first real confrontation happened when the guest who had tried to check in to the out-of-service room actually did it. It was 2 in the morning, and the lobby clock read 2:13 when the bell by the door chimed. The man at the desk looked like he had misplaced a life. He was dressed in a rumpled suit, his shoes scuffed and wet from the evening rain. He did not look like someone who had pre-booked or had a reservation. His face had the particular openness of exhaustion. He asked for a room, and I told him we were full, except for a maintenance block on 412, which was out of service. He tilted his head and smiled in a way I remember as polite and slightly frantic. He asked to see the room. I said no. He asked for a manager. Mark was gone for the night. He asked for my name. I told him. He said, "I liked this. Do you mind if I call you Dan?" He asked for the key again and set his palm on the counter in a way that left me feeling observed. We argued in a way that had 8 exchanges before he left satisfied and before he went upstairs and silently opened a door. Our exchange went like this. "You cannot go into room 412, I said. "Why not?" he asked. "Why does a room have the right to be closed?" He smelled of rain. "It is out of service," I said. "We have a safety notice and maintenance scheduled." He laughed softly. "The hotel is holding its breath," I said. "We cannot let guests stay in rooms that are not inspected." He leaned forward. "I just need one night," he said. "My car is gone and the rain is a bed. I can pay cash." I refused, I said. "We have protocols. We cannot allow someone in an out-of-service space." He smiled like the rain was inside him. "Pay the fee," he said. "I do not want trouble." I called security. Voice calm, voice firm, and he put his hand on the counter like a promise. He said, "No, call security." The night air is full of negotiations. I told him gently, "Please leave." He slowly picked up his bag and left, but then circled the lobby and walked to the elevator and pressed the button for floor 4. Maintenance heard the elevator and called down that someone had accessed the corridor. Theo texted me that the camera outside 412 had a glare and the light by the stairwell flickered. I went upstairs to the 4th floor and walked down the corridor. I listened to the hum of the furnace and to the drip from a pipe and to my own breath. The smell of smoke grew as I approached the door. The plaque read "out of service," but the latch was bent and there were fresh scuff marks on the carpet. I stood by the door and heard the faintest sound like someone shifting a blanket. I knocked and called room service and heard nothing. I felt my body sharpen. I left a note under the door with a maintenance ticket and a request that no one enter, and I descended back to the lobby where Mark had a cigarette waiting outside and a look that said trouble had come climbing the stairs. The first time I spoke directly with the guest who had used the out-of-service door, it was at 3 in the morning and he was at the bar, helping himself to a drink, and listening to the salt and lemon of the complimentary fruit. He introduced himself as Paul and gave me a story about being in town for a funeral. I asked which funeral, and he spoke in fragments like a man reading from a page that had burnt at the edges. I asked where he was staying. He said, "I am not sure." He sipped his drink. "Why are you here now?" I said. He said, "I like the night. It is honest." He paused. "You can keep a secret in the night, and it does not judge." I told him it was against policy to use an out-of-service room. He nodded and smiled and said, "You do not know what it is to be unwanted. I do." I asked what he meant. He looked at me. "I'm a kind of ghost," he said. "Or at least I look like one to people who have places to be." He finished his drink and left his glass on the counter like a full stop. I probed. He must have known he could not have a room. He said. He shrugged. "That is the point of being invisible, so you can watch. No one looks for you if you are not meant to be found." I listened and felt like an investigator listening to a suspect who might confess if only you asked the exact wrong question. He said, "You ought to be careful with spaces that say out of service, because sometimes they are resting, and sometimes they are hiding." I laughed as if to break the weight of his words, and he said, "You will see." The man left and left behind his scent, tobacco, and something like lemon and old paper. I wrote him down. Later, I checked the log. Paul was nowhere to be found on any registration. I asked reservations. There was no call. I checked the security feed. The camera outside 412 had 43 minutes of static, and then a sliver of grain where the corridor appeared empty, but a shadow crossed the frame where the light above the plaque seemed to dim and swell. The recording was time-stamped and corrupted, in a way that suggested interference, but also had a human heartbeat of something like negligence. At some point, curiosity turned into a program. I started carrying a cheap camera I had bought online and a tiny voice recorder, and I taped small notes to the back of the boiler. I pressed my ear to walls and listened for floors creaking and HVAC adjustments. I spoke to people who might have useful but ordinary memories. I told Maria, the housekeeper, to tell me the name of anyone who mentioned room 412. She said she had seen the cart moved once and that an old man named Henry used to try to rent the room every winter. I called the city records to check the property that occupied the block before the hotel, and found an old business license in a scanned PDF that mentioned a boarding house that had burned partially and been rebuilt. Office had a note from years ago that said room 412 had been left closed after a water leak and that repairs had been planned. The file listed a name in a different hand that seemed to be scratched in as a later entry, Paul H., no address. I felt the file as a small victory and also a question like a splinter. As my investigations deepened, the narrative of the staff grew by inches. Mark, the general manager, told me to be careful that I was not fabricating stress into phantom problems. He said the hotel had insurance and corporate eyes, and that they did not need unsanctioned scrutiny. Mark had been with the company almost 15 years, and he had a way of looking at a problem from the angle of profit and policy. I understood him, but I also thought about the way he had looked when he smoked outside the loading bay, eyes half on the street and half on the sky. Maria, the head housekeeper, cried once when she told me that her grandmother used to say, "Some rooms remember the people they had." She brushed her hand over the plaque and apologized to it like a person who had been rude. Theo, the maintenance man, laughed and told me old buildings made sounds like bones. Anna, the front desk clerk, brought me coffee and stories about guests who booked extra nights and then never opened their doors. Officer Ramirez from the local precinct stopped by one night to fill out a routine report, and his presence turned the hotel into something monitored and official. I named them all in my notebook, and the names grew into a map. Each person described small pieces that did not line up into a big picture, but that had the texture of truth. One night, the situation escalated into a physical confrontation that I will not forget. It was a week after the man in the suit, and a series of other small disturbances had left me unmoored. The hotel phone rang, and a voice said, "There is someone on the 4th floor, and they are not leaving." I felt a familiar clamp in my chest. I went up with Theo, and we carried a flashlight and a master key ring that rattled like a promise. The hallway lights were dim, the carpet cold under our shoes, and there was a low draft that smelled faintly of something like crushed mint. We stopped at room 412, and the door was open a crack. The smoke smell was strong, and there were fresh cigarette ashes in a small tray on the nightstand. The TV was on, but the screen showed nothing but gray snow. We called out, "Hello, we are checking for anyone in the room." No answer. We pushed the door, and the room felt like a stage set for a memory. The bed was made, but the blanket had a fold that suggested someone had lain there earlier. A chair sat facing the window. The window faced the alley and rattled slightly, casting light like a shipping crate. I stepped closer, and there on the bedside table, someone had left a napkin with a message written in a shaky hand. It read, "I do not want to leave again." The handwriting was older, and the letters leaned like a man who had been carrying something heavy. I picked up the napkin and felt a trace of tobacco on my fingers. Theo tried the bathroom and found nothing but an empty tub. We called the front desk and demanded the guest list, and the night manager, Mark, answered and said the guest was not registered. We called the number left on a piece of paper in the room, and the voice said, "Nobody here," then hung up. The confrontation became louder
because there was a sound from the closet, a sound like someone breathing. I opened the closet and found it empty except for an old coat hung neatly and a pair of shoes that had been dusted with flour, maybe from a bakery. I felt a pressure on my chest like a hand. I stepped back and remarked aloud, "We need to call the police right now." Theo hesitated. "We do not do well with panic in the night," he said, but this was not confident. I felt my throat dry. We called Officer Ramirez, and within 20 minutes he was there with 2 officers and a clipboard. They asked questions and recorded statements. I watched as the officers treated the room like a small scene of interest, and I felt the weight of the official gaze. In the end, they logged a trespassing report and took the shoes as evidence, and an officer who called himself Ramirez filed a form into their system with coffee stains. The procedural description of that moment stuck with me because it was specific and calm in the middle of a rising storm. An officer photographed the scene, took notes on a standardized form, and created an evidence bag for the items found. They drew a diagram of the room's layout and assigned a case number and a report that would sit in a cold folder on someone's desk. The official language made the event into paperwork, but it did not answer why the room had been used or who had left the note. I will describe the police procedure here because it matters to understanding how facts are created from chaos. The responding officer took a detailed statement from me and from Theo and logged the incident into the precinct's digital system. He photographed the room from 4 angles and recorded the time of entry and the condition of the door latch. The shoes were placed in an evidence seal and labeled with the date, case number, and who found them. The officers ran the shoes for trace DNA and fingerprints and created a chain of custody
form that listed each person who handled the items. A formal report was filed and assigned to a detective for follow-up. These actions do not guarantee answers, but they create a trail that can be verified across departments and that is useful should the event connect to other incidents. The paperwork made the room less a rumor and more a small node in municipal memory. After that night, the hotel community acted like a nervous family. Guests joked too loudly about haunted rooms. Mark insisted we post extra signs about safety and that all maintenance tags be documented. Theo sealed the closet for the night and warned staff not to touch anything without gloves. Maria refused to clean room 412 anymore and slept with a rosary she had not carried in years. Officer Ramirez came a second time to place a patrol outside during the late shift, and he advised increased logging of late arrivals. The city inspector came and looked at the plaque and at the records and wrote down dates and contract numbers. Several regular guests moved rooms as if comfort could be rearranged by distance. These actions changed the texture of the hotel. The room became a subject of whispered conversation and of pages in my notebook. My sleep narrowed to checklists. One of the strangest parts of the investigation came from contradictory evidence. Some elements pointed to a living person who had used the room clandestinely. Other traces suggested the opposite. A night watch camera caught a faint outline of a figure passing the corridor, but the thermal image showed only a cold spot, like a door left open. Housekeeping found an old key stamped with a date from the 80s tucked beneath the mattress, along with a receipt from a bakery that had closed decades earlier. A guest who had stayed 2 doors down claimed to have seen a man in a tweed coat sitting on the bed and staring at the ceiling, but when the officers checked the room hours later, there were no footprints in the dust. Someone mailed a letter to the hotel addressed to room 412, and it was stamped with a postmark from a town in a state that was 4 hours away. The contradictions multiplied, and the more we tried to stitch them together, the more mismatched the seams became. I found myself balancing between wanting a single rational explanation and accepting that the truth might be a braid of small improbabilities. There was one person who offered a history that felt like a key. An elderly woman named Evelyn, who ran a small antique shop across the street, came to the lobby one evening cradling a teacup and a cache of gossip. Evelyn said she remembered when the building was a boarding house and that a tenant named Paul H. had lived there and complained every winter about the cold. She said he used to sit by the window and talk to the radiator, and that one night there had been a fire in a back room and the house was closed up for a season. Evelyn told us about how tenants come and go and that buildings keep stories like scars. She said,
I do not believe in ghosts, but I believe in places that remember. Her description of Paul H. fit the brief sketches we had found in records and in the napkin, and the man who had asked for a room had used the same clipped consonants when he said he did not want to leave again. Evelyn gave me a photograph, she said, she found at a flea market, of a man in a suit on a small paper, and written on the back were the words, Paul H., room 412, 1973. I held the photograph and felt a small electric shock of recognition. The photograph became a small totem in our inquiry. It meant nothing and everything. The tension in the story had to be recorded in scenes that felt like pressure points. I will describe 3 moments of heightened tension that were central and that changed how I moved in the building. The first moment was when I discovered the napkin with the message, "I do not want to leave again," on the bedside table. I had expected an empty room and instead found evidence of presence. The line hit me because it spoke of repetition, of return, and suggested that whatever happened had happened before. I felt a contraction in my chest, and the room tilted like the floor had become a stage. My hand smelled of tobacco, and the lamp was warm, as if someone had just touched it. I put the note in an evidence bag, because Officer Ramirez had asked us to preserve any artifact, and I felt foolishly like a participant in a ritual. The second moment came when Maria, the housekeeper, woke me the next morning with a pale face and told me that she had found 3 footprints on the floral carpet heading from the corridor to the window and back again. Each print was small, maybe the size of a child or a small woman's shoe, and the dust inside the print looked as if it had been brushed away in a hurry. Maria said she heard singing too, a small hymn, as if someone was practicing to remember words. The sound of her voice in the morning felt like a bell. I went up with Theo, and we stood in the corridor listening, and we both felt the hairs on our arms raise. The prints were subtle but present, and the window latch had been twisted the wrong way. It suggested someone had been inside, and also someone who might have been trying to leave. The third moment of tension arrived at 3 in the morning on a night when the hotel was full and a storm pressed against the windows, and the city seemed to be turning the sound
of rain into a drum. I was alone at the desk sorting through invoices when the elevator chimed and a woman in a hotel robe walked out carrying a small suitcase. She had wet hair and a look like she had been traveling a long distance without a map. She crossed the lobby and looked up at the 4th floor and said in a voice that trembled, "I need to see room 412. I need to know if my sister is there." I told her quietly, "Ma'am, we cannot allow that." She grabbed my arm like an anchor and said, "My sister Eva checked in years ago. She disappeared. She was last seen leaving for a walk and never came back. Please, I will pay." I begged the desk for a record. The woman looked at me with tears, and I felt a destabilizing pity. I called Officer Ramirez, who came in with a frown and a flashlight, and he agreed to run a check on missing persons while he began looking at old records. The woman's hand had left an imprint on my wrist like a small map. She demanded we open the door, and when we did, the room was empty. But she cried and said, "That is her shoe. That is her favorite scarf," and then pointed to a chair where a scarf lay folded, and it matched a sweater she had described in an old photograph. The convergence of claim and artifact made the room feel like it had been tuned to remember a life. The woman's wail when we failed to produce her sister fully pierced the hush of the night. These tension moments were each about 500 to 600 characters in my notes, and they pushed me to search deeper. The search revealed a backstory to a man who had been called Paul H. in old registers, and who had worked as a night clerk at that very building decades before. I found accounts in the local newspaper archives of a man who had a habit of walking the halls late and of checking on spaces that others ignored. The accounts did not call him violent. They called him persistent. People said he liked to leave notes, and he trusted rooms the way people trust old friends. There were also mentions of his loneliness, and a note in a later obituary that hinted at a man who had not been missed when he moved away. I began to build a portrait of a figure who blurred the line between tenant and keeper. The figure was not quite an antagonist in the sense of deliberate harm, but he became a presence whose habits had left footprints in the building and whose absence had been a thread stretching back from our present to a stitched past. The investigation led to a contradiction I could not dissolve. Some evidence was physical and some was anecdotal. Fingerprints taken from the cigarette butt on the
Nightstand returned partial matches to a household in a town 2 states away and a name that cannot be confirmed. The bakery receipt dated back to 1986, a shop that the city record said had closed in 1991. The photograph from Evelyn seemed authentic but had aged unevenly. The napkin handwriting matched a sample taken from a letter found in a second-hand book bought by Mrs. Carter, who owned the bed and breakfast. We tried to correlate the items, and they refused to lock into a single timeline. Each new fact added to the tangle. At about 1/3 of the way through this story, I want to stop and ask you a question and invite you to leave a comment because community memory often corrects gaps. If you were in my shoes, would you try to find the person who was using the out-of-service room, or would you avoid opening a door that wants to be closed? Tell me in one word, choose shadow, sound, or door, and leave a sentence if you want. I ask because the replies I get help form how I proceed, and because other viewers often provide details I miss. The comment box becomes a kind of collective ledger, and sometimes people send in old documents or photos that change the shape of an inquiry. So comment now and help me trace the outlines of this story. Soon after I posted a request for old records, a woman named Liza messaged me with an old ledger she said she had copied from her mother's things. The ledger showed a list of tenants and a name, Paul H., with the notation, moved away 1980. Liza's mother had been a chambermaid and had kept lists in the margins. Liza offered to come by and speak with me, and when she arrived, she smelled like lemon and hand soap and told a story about a man who came nightly to rub the radiators and to listen to the pipes. She said he always asked if the radio was on, and he would sit and pretend the songs were letters. She said, I do not think he meant harm. She said, I think he meant to make a place private enough to hold someone. Liza gave me a small oblong key that she said had been found behind a loose tile, and that key had been stamped with numbers worn thin. The key was small and fit a cabinet more than a door, but when I leaned it into my hand, it felt like a secret. As the weeks passed, the phenomenon attracted the sort of attention that invites documentation and speculation. A local news blogger came with a camera and asked questions about our haunted room. He filmed me at the front desk, and I answered the questions like a person who had learned to compartmentalize fear into answers. The footage was posted, and the comments ranged from mocking to deeply sympathetic. A conspiracy group began combing through the security footage frame by frame and posted a slow-motion analysis of a door click and open with no visible cause. Some of the comments reached the shape of a rumor, and a man wrote he had lived in room 412 in the 70s and that he had left because the building felt like breathing. The rumor swelled, and I realized how stories grow when fed by interest. There was a day when visibility increased and a small turning came. An insurance inspector came with a clipboard and a woman from corporate on the phone, and the lobby felt like an office. They looked at the plaque and at the maintenance tickets, and then they looked at the files and said, "We have to condemn the room until further notice." A clean official voice. Mark reluctantly agreed, and we locked the door and placed a sign that said, "Temporarily closed for safety," and an online notice to avoid bookings on that room until repairs. The official condemnation felt like a verdict, and for a while the building shifted back into a more ordinary rhythm. Guests stopped talking at breakfast about phantom smokers, and the staff relaxed. But the story had not ended. After the condemnation, an object appeared in the hallway, a small suitcase with a tag that read, "Return to sender." There was no guest associated with it. The tag was old and the letters faded, and inside there was a bundle of photographs, the edges browned, and a single napkin with a name written in block letters, Eva H.
When I showed these items to Officer Ramirez, he opened a file and said, "We will run these through the system and see if there are any missing persons reports that match." The police involvement deepened the formal trail, and the photographs were cataloged and scanned and entered into evidence. In the months that followed, the City Records Office found no open missing persons case under the name Eva H. that matched the photographs. But they did find a local intake form from 1975 that reported an unidentified woman seen leaving the hotel after a fight and then never being seen again. The form was thin and older than the modern database, and it had been misfiled. The presence of that paper made the room less a rumor and more like a place with a point of intersection with real human lives. The misfiled form suggested that the past had been reorganized into a shape that made it hard to find. The document had a stamp from the local sheriff's office dated '76 and a penciled note, illegible, at the corner. The penciled note said, "Follow up, not completed." The idea of follow-up not completed lodged in my mind. There were people who reacted by leaving objects at the door as if offerings. A woman named Clara left a small ceramic bird she said reminded her of her sister. A man named Lewis left a pair of gloves and a letter addressed to no one. Another guest, named Priya, left a cup with lipstick that did not match any known brand. Each object felt like someone trying to fill a hole with a thing. The hotel accumulated artifacts until the hallway by the out-of-service door looked like a small memorial. I photographed each item and put it in an evidence box that sat in the office like a shrine to unanswered questions. As the months passed, the community arrived at a consensus that was not a solution but a way to live with the unknown. Mark decided to renovate the room and replace the carpet and investigate the plumbing. We contracted with a restoration company, and they found, under the baseboard, a bundle of stamps and a set of letters signed Paul H. and dated 1978. The letters were odd. They were to different names, and they read like small confessions or small catalogs of the day. One letter said, "I stayed too long in the dark and forgot the name of the morning." Another said, "If the room forgets me, do I become furniture?" The letters read like someone trying to anchor themselves to language. We scanned them into the corporate file. They were aged, fragile, and human, and they smelled like old paper and tea. The restoration made the room physically new, but the letters and prints and photographs made the space older in a human way. After the renovation, corporate allowed the room to be used again, but with new furniture and a fresh plaque that read, "Temporarily renovated." The first booking after the renovation was a young couple celebrating a birthday. They were cheerful and held hands at breakfast and left a note that said, "Thank you for the quiet." It seemed like an ending, but I knew endings in buildings are restful for a time rather than absolute. The objects left in the hallway were returned to a safe because Mark wanted the hotel to manage liability, and the artifacts were cataloged and locked away. We moved on, but we also kept the box. Officer Ramirez visited now and then, and we shared coffee and quiet reports and updates about leads that came and went. There were consequences for me beyond the paperwork. I began locking my apartment differently, and I stopped taking long walks alone at night. I found myself waking up at 2 and thinking about the out-of-service plaque and the way a small brass rectangle could become a threshold. The presence of these events made me more attentive to the edges of ordinary life and more aware of how many people live with small, unresolved things in their pockets. I lost a degree of easy confidence and gained a slow patience for unanswered questions. The hotel became a place where I practiced staying careful without turning into paranoia. I would lock doors from the inside when I fell asleep. And I would check the corridors and pat the motion sensors and make lists. 3 months after the original incident, the case had not been solved, but something shifted. A woman named Liza sent a message that her aunt, who lived in another town, had recognized the woman in the photograph as someone who had boarded with them decades earlier, and had apparently run off to follow a man who promised travel and never returned. The aunt said, "This is not a mystery of spirits, but of poor choices and a hidden life." The identification narrowed the mystery into a human story of disappearance that felt both more ordinary and more painful. It suggested the possibility that Eva had chosen to leave or had been persuaded to leave, and that the record-keeping of the day had been insufficient to capture the movement. At the same time, there remained objects that did not fit the tidy explanation the person identification provided. The mixture of answers and new questions hardened into one of the central truths of this case. Some mysteries resolve half and leave the rest as elegy. 6 months later, the hotel had changed more than I expected. The out-of-service plaque was gone, and the 4th floor had been repainted. The evidence box sat in a locked file drawer, but I kept the photograph Evelyn had given me in my wallet, and I would sometimes take it out and feel the paper like an amulet. Officer Ramirez had transferred to a different beat, but he visited once and said he had closed his file for lack of prosecutable evidence. He said he liked the open-endedness of certain things, and that some doors are better left marked. Mark had left the hotel for a corporate position, and the new manager ran the building with a different tempo. Maria had quit and started a small cleaning business, and she sent me a postcard with a photograph of a sunlit porch. Theo retired because his knees had worn down, and he sent me a toolbox filled with small screws and a note, "I cannot fix everything." The community around the hotel had changed with time. Guests came and told stories and left. In small ways, the building healed. The plaque was replaced by a tasteful sign that read "Renovated Suite," and the hotel advertised a new breakfast menu. The narrative of the hotel had been edited by time and by the decisions people made to keep living. My backstory matters because it explains why I stayed. I had learned to catalog small noises because I trusted patterns. As a child, I learned to watch for footsteps across hardwood and to diagnose a leaky pipe by the timbre of the drip. Losing my brother taught me that unpredictability is not an argument for paralysis. Working nights taught me how to measure silence like distance. I trained in hospitality, and I learned the language of registers and check-ins.
And corporate policy. My father taught me to fix an engine, and my mother taught me to fold sheets like prayers. The grief and the skills combined into a type of duty to notice. When I saw a thread of oddities, I pulled on it, because I believed that small facts could accumulate into larger truths. My curiosity became my job, and also my way of honoring memory. I did not know then that curiosity could become obsession, and that obsession could turn the ordinary making of a night shift into an investigation that demanded patience and caused pain. The figure of Paul H. needed a backstory too, because his habits persisted in the weave of the building. He was a man who had once worked in the hotel when it was a boarding house. Records and oral histories described him as a clerk and a tenant who liked the night, and who apparently had a habit of leaving notes to himself and to others. He was not described as violent, but as lonely and meticulous. In the 1970s, his name appeared in a neighbor's memory as someone who would check radiators and who kept a small tin of cough drops in his pocket. After a fire, he appears to have moved out and then later returned to visit. The letters we found suggested a man who wrote to people who might have been lost to him and to himself. The figure of Paul H. as antagonist is wrong. He was more a presence made up of habitual gestures and marginal files and a hunger for place. That hunger can look unsettling when it plays out across decades and leaves notes and objects behind that do not align with modern expectations about privacy and occupancy. He became, for us, a memory that the building held on to. There were procedural consequences and technical details that changed how the hotel operated and how the police regarded similar calls. The police changed their protocol for an out-of-service room being breached and instituted a checklist for secure rooms. Housekeeping now photographed any anomalies and logged them with timestamps. Maintenance replaced the lock with a smart lock that recorded entries and sent automatic alerts if tampered with. The chain of custody forms became standard for any item found, and all guest interactions that involved rooms marked out of service required at least 2 witnesses and a call to corporate. These procedural shifts cost money and time, and they changed the flow of night work into a more bureaucratic routine. They were small changes but meaningful, and they shaped how we responded to strangeness in the future. 6 months after the first evidence of the out-of-service room, the pieces had formed a map that did not fully resolve. We had photographs and letters and a name and a probable absence. We had artifacts and a family member who identified a photograph and a misfiled document that suggested follow-up had been neglected in the past. We had a mystery that contained elements of human disappearance and possibly of people using a closed room in ways we could not comfortably explain. We had a hotel that had tightened its procedures and a staff that had been shaken. And we had an object I kept in my wallet, a photograph of a man in an old suit who had written words that read like a small confession. There is a thing about stories like this. They change the people who tell them. I found myself thinking differently about thresholds and about how many people pass through a building holding hidden lives. In the end, I made changes that felt concrete. I installed a small security camera of my own in the lobby corner with motion alert and a battery backup. I changed the way I locked my apartment, and I wrote more carefully in my notebook. And I learned to sleep with a light on. I also learned to tolerate unclosed questions. I learned that not every blank can be filled without tearing the fabric of other people's lives, and that some answers demand more resources than a night desk can bring. The conclusion is both simple and unresolved. We replaced the plaque, we cataloged artifacts, and we let the building keep some of its shadows. Every now and then a guest asks about the story, and I tell them a small version. They listen and sometimes add their own rumor. The hotel continues to host arrivals and departures, and the fourth floor holds new bookings. A month after the main events, the first epilogue begins. 1 month later, the hotel had a new lock and a formal incident report in the city archives. Liza's ledger was donated to the local historical society, and the photograph Evelyn had found was displayed in a small case downtown. Maria had started her cleaning business and sent a postcard. Theo had taken up gardening, and the scent of soil showed up in the lobby from time to time. Officer Ramirez had written a memo recommending procedure changes, and corporate had approved a budget for smart locks. The tension in the staff relaxed into relief. Guests who used to whisper grew louder in their jokes, and the lobby resumed its commerce of arrivals and departures. I continued to carry the little leather notebook, but I folded new entries into it like patchwork. The city's cold file had been nudged, but not solved. We celebrated small victories with coffee and a shared pastry, and that became our method of coping with an unsolved thing. 3 months later, the second epilogue takes shape. There had been a small community meeting where people who had been affected by the case sat with cups and a city archivist, and we looked at documents and photographs. Someone from the local radio station did a segment, and later a listener called in with an anecdote about a woman named Ava who had left town and returned with a different name. The radio segment brought forward a woman who thought she might have a memory of a girl leaving with a man with a suitcase. She seemed certain and also uncertain. The police reopened an old paper file long enough to confirm that follow-up had been incomplete. A detective made a request for additional records, and a relative in another state provided copies of letters that suggested the woman in the photo had traveled and then settled elsewhere for a period of time. The new materials made the story less spectral and more human. At 3 months, the pattern leaned toward partial resolution and toward a narrative that connected a litany of small errors and missed connections. People learned to tolerate the idea that truth can be distributed across time and interference, and that sometimes a disappearance is a series of small decisions rather than a single event. 6 months on, the third epilogue is longer and more reflective. The hotel now lists the renovated suite online with a footnote about its history and a tasteful reference to retro charm. Guests accept that buildings have memory, and some leave tokens on the concierge desk that we place in the evidence box. I visited my mother's bed and breakfast and held a teacup and told her the outline of the story, and she said, "People are like rooms sometimes. They keep things because they have no other place to put them." That line stuck with me. I found that my life shifted toward a more careful attentiveness. I ran my hands over locks before bed, and I learned to ask more precise questions of people. In the months since the events, I have also taken to meeting with local archivists and volunteers who are trying to build public databases that make old municipal records easier to search.
The small system improvements we advocated for were implemented across a few other hotels in the chain, and corporate later published a brief guide about handling out-of-service rooms and preserving artifacts. Officer Ramirez's recommendations became a template for documentation and chain of custody protocols in certain local calls. The letters we found were scanned and placed in the local library collection. They are accessible for anyone who wants to read the thin, careful handwriting of a man trying to anchor himself in words. The photograph that Evelyn gave me sits in a drawer, and when I take it out, I press my thumb to the image like a way to check physical reality. The image does not move, but it reminds me that people once lived here who are not entirely erased. I am often asked what I learned from all of this. The simplest answer is that buildings remember better than we do, and that leaving plaque signs does not erase history. I learned that attention can be a kindness or an intrusion, and that we have
To choose carefully how we pursue answers. I learned to value small procedures because they create records and help future investigators. I learned that your job can become your witness. I learned that some things cannot be resolved without time and luck, and that acceptance is not the same as surrender. And I still sometimes walk the fourth floor and listen to the hum of the furnace, and imagine that I can catch the echo of someone pacing and counting the minutes. The last line of my leather notebook entry reads, "I do not want to close the door completely because a door can heal when it is remembered." If this story moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments as I asked earlier. Tell me one word, shadow, sound, or door, and add anything else you recall about similar places where a closed room kept a story. Your memories help create context and sometimes lead to new discoveries. If you want more stories like this and investigations that mix feeling and facts, consider subscribing to the channel. We tell true stories with care and check the records so that the strange does not become merely sensational. Thank you for listening to What Happened in the Night and for keeping small things in mind when you cross a threshold.